She had a loaded gun pressed against her chest, and she refused to kneel. Hell's Kitchen, New York. A waitress nobody remembered existed. A mob boss nobody dared to cross. One spilled cup of coffee. One impossible moment that should have ended with a body on the floor and a chalk outline nobody would photograph twice. Instead, it ended with something far more dangerous: his curiosity. This is the story of Elena Mercer, a woman who had nothing left to lose, facing a man who had everything to protect. Stay until the end. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The coffee machine had been broken for 11 days. Elena knew this the way she knew everything about the diner. Not because anyone told her, not because there was a maintenance log somewhere that somebody actually updated, but because she was the one who wrestled with it every morning at 5:47 a.m., jamming her palm against the side panel until the heating element shuddered back to life like a sick animal that hadn't quite decided whether to die yet. 11 days of that. 11 mornings of burned knuckles and the smell of scorched metal and the particular brand of silence that only exists in a city before the city remembers it's awake. She was 27 years old and she looked 38 on her worst days, which had become most days. The diner was called Carla's, though nobody named Carla had owned it for at least 2 decades. The current owner was a man named Bertolucci, who showed up twice a month to collect the cash drawer receipts and complained that the grease traps needed cleaning, as if complaining about them and cleaning them were the same action. They were not. Elena cleaned them. Elena cleaned everything. She opened, she closed, she covered shifts when Marcus called in sick, which was often, because Marcus had a drinking problem that he described as a situational stress response, and Elena didn't have the energy to argue about language with a man who smelled like bourbon at noon. She made $9.40 an hour plus tips. The tips were not good. Hell's Kitchen had been gentrifying in fits and starts for years, which meant the neighborhood existed in 2 realities simultaneously: the new wine bars and the exposed brick apartments with waiting lists, and then the older, denser version underneath it all, the version that still had check-cashing places and laundromats with handwritten signs and diners like Carla's, which served eggs at any hour and coffee strong enough to strip paint, and didn't ask questions about why you were eating alone at 2 a.m. wearing the same clothes you'd worn the day before. Elena lived in both realities and belonged to neither. She wasn't poor enough to qualify for the programs, not stable enough to feel secure, too exhausted to plan for anything beyond the next 2 weeks of bills. Her mother's name was Ruth. Ruth had been sick for 3 years now. The kind of sick that didn't announce itself cleanly, the kind that accumulated like interest on a debt you couldn't pay off. One specialist and one copay and one prescription at a time. Ruth had been a seamstress. Had been, past tense, because her hands had stopped cooperating about 18 months ago. And now she lived in a second-floor apartment in the Bronx that Elena paid for, along with the homemaid who came 3 days a week and was named Dolores, and was the most competent person Elena had ever met, which made the fact that Elena could barely afford her feel like a specific cruelty the universe had arranged personally. Elena did not think about this constantly. She had learned not to. She had learned to put the numbers in a box in the back of her skull and close the lid. Because opening the lid while she was carrying hot plates or managing the morning rush or trying to explain to a customer for the 4th time that they did not, in fact, serve avocado toast, opening that box while doing any of those things accomplished nothing except making her hands shake. Her hands shook sometimes anyway. She ignored that too. The night Damien Moreau walked into Carla's, it was a Tuesday in early October, the kind of October evening that New York produces specifically to make you believe winter won't be that bad before winter proves you completely wrong. The temperature had dropped suddenly around 6, and the diner had filled with the usual mix. A couple of cab drivers, a woman in scrubs who came in every Tuesday and ordered the same soup and never spoke to anyone. 2 young men from the construction site 3 blocks over who flirted with Elena in a harmless, half-hearted way that she neither encouraged nor found particularly offensive, because it cost her nothing to smile and it cost them nothing to try, and nothing ever came of it. She noticed the black SUV first. 2 of them, actually, parked directly in front of the fire hydrant outside, which was the kind of thing that only happened when someone wanted to make a point about parking tickets being irrelevant to them personally. Elena was wiping down the counter when the door opened and the temperature in the room changed. Not literally, but something shifted. The 2 construction workers stopped mid-sentence. The woman in scrubs looked up from her soup and then immediately looked back down. Even the cab drivers, who were mid-argument about something involving the BQE, went quiet. 3 men came in first. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they were wearing something, a posture, a readiness, eyes that moved across a room the way you'd sweep a room if you were looking for exits and threats simultaneously. They fanned out without being told to, one near the door, 2 flanking the center aisle, and then Damien Moreau walked in behind them. Elena knew who he was. Everybody in Hell's Kitchen knew who Damien Moreau was, the way you knew about weather systems. Not because you'd studied meteorology, but because the consequences showed up in your life whether you'd paid attention or not. He controlled a significant portion of what moved through lower Manhattan and the western edge of the Bronx, not drugs specifically, though that was part of it, but the infrastructure underneath the drugs and the numbers and the protection arrangements and the dozen other arrangements that kept certain economies functional in ways that never appeared in any official accounting. He was 38. He was from money, old money, the kind that predated him by 2 generations and had metastasized into something that bore no resemblance to its original form. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Elena made in 2 months. He sat down at the center table without looking at the menu, which was irrelevant because the bodyguard nearest to him pulled a chair out before he reached it. Elena watched all of this from behind the counter with the specific expression she had perfected over years of customer service. Neutral, present, not visibly reacting to anything. She picked up her order pad and walked over. "Evening," she said. "Coffee?" He looked at her then. Not the way most men in that diner looked at her. The cab drivers with their casual appraisals, the construction workers with their performed interest. He looked at her the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you were deciding whether to move. Brief, assessing, categorizing. "Black," he said, "and whatever passes for a real meal in a place like this." She didn't flinch at a place like this. She'd heard worse framed more pleasantly. "Pot roast is good tonight," she said. "Or I can do a steak, medium rare if you're not in a hurry." "I'm always in a hurry," he said. "Pot roast." She wrote it down and walked back to the counter, and that should have been the extent of their interaction. A transaction, a plate of food, a check, the SUVs pulling away from the hydrant. That was how it should have gone. What happened instead was that one of the bodyguards, the one near the door, a thick man with a jaw like a brick, and the particular blank quality of someone who had learned to turn off the part of his face that registered human emotion, stepped into the aisle at the exact moment Elena was returning with the coffee. Not accidentally. She understood that immediately, in the half-second before the shoulder check sent her off balance, because accidents have a quality to them, a kind of mutual surprise, and there was no surprise on his face when her elbow hit the edge of the table and the coffee went sideways. The cup didn't shatter, it tipped, and the contents, full, hot, freshly poured, spread across the tablecloth and cascaded directly onto Damien Moreau's lap and the lower portion of his charcoal jacket. The sound that came out of the diner in that moment was nothing. Complete silence. The soup woman had stopped breathing. The construction workers had gone rigid. Damien stood up slowly. He looked down at the spreading stain. Then he looked at Elena. "Do you have any idea," he said, very quietly, "what you just did?" "Your man walked into me," Elena said. Her voice was steady. She was distantly aware that her heart was doing something unpleasant against her ribs, but her voice was steady. "I didn't spill that coffee. He knocked me into the table." Something moved across Damien's face. Not anger exactly. Anger would have been more readable. It was more like recalibration. "Neil," he said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "I'm sorry?" "Neil." He reached inside his jacket and produced the gun with the casual ease of a man reaching for his phone. He placed the barrel against her sternum, not roughly, almost gently, which was somehow worse, and apologized. Elena looked at the gun. She looked at his face. She thought, with a strange clinical clarity, about the 11 days of the broken coffee machine and the grease traps and the $9.40 an hour and her mother's hands that didn't work anymore, and Dolores, who she could barely afford, and the box in the back of her skull with the numbers in it. The box she kept closed because opening it accomplished nothing. She thought about all of that, and then something inside her, some last structural support that had been bending under weight for years, simply stopped bending. "If you shout at me one more time," she said, and her voice was not loud, it was almost conversational, "I will fight back. I don't care what happens after that." The silence in the diner became a different kind of silence. Damien did not move. "I have a gun against your chest," he said slowly, as if she might not have noticed. "I'm aware," Elena said. "I said what I said." 5 seconds passed. They felt longer. His eyes were very dark and very still, and she held them because looking away would have been the end of something she couldn't afford to lose, whatever it was inside her that was still standing upright. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, precise, like a cut. He lowered the gun. He looked at her for another moment. Genuinely looked at her, perhaps for the first time since he'd walked in, and then he buttoned his jacket over the stain and turned and walked out of the diner without another word. The bodyguards followed. The SUVs pulled away from the hydrant. Elena stood in the center of the diner and did not shake until she got to the kitchen, where she gripped the edge of the prep counter and breathed through her nose until her hands stopped. Marcus appeared from the back, having apparently witnessed none of this. "Table 4's pot roast is up," he said. "Okay," she said. "You good?" "Fine," she said. She wasn't fine. But she picked up the plate and carried it to table 4, because the pot roast wasn't going to carry itself, and the diner wasn't going to stop running, because something had just happened that she didn't have words for yet. It was only when she cleared the table 20 minutes later that she found the money. A single folded stack of bills beneath the coffee-stained tablecloth, held down by the empty sugar dispenser. She counted it twice in the kitchen with the door closed. $1,000. And beneath the money, a white card. No logo, no phone number. Just 6 handwritten words in a spare, compressed script. "We will finish this conversation soon." She stood there with the card in one hand and the money in the other, and tried to make sense of what had just happened, and couldn't, entirely. What she understood was this. A man who could have killed her had chosen not to. She didn't know yet whether that was better or worse. She suspected the answer was complicated. She suspected she was about to find out. She put the money in her coat pocket. She put the card in her apron pocket, separate, where she could feel it against her hip for the rest of the shift. She did not tell Marcus. She did not tell the soup woman, who had finished eating and left a $3 tip and not made eye contact on the way out. She did not call anyone. She closed the diner at midnight, walked the 4 blocks to the subway in the cold, and sat on the downtown platform and stared at the opposite wall and tried to figure out what kind of trouble she had just walked into. The kind you could see coming or the kind that was already behind you? That was the question. In her experience, trouble announced itself clearly about half the time. The other half, you only understood what it was once it had its hands around your throat. The train came. She rode it home. She counted the money again in her apartment with the lights on, sitting at the kitchen table that was also where she paid bills, and also where she ate, and also where she sat when the numbers got too heavy to carry standing up. $1,000. Real. All of it. She put it in the coffee can she kept on the top shelf behind a bag of rice she'd bought 3 months ago and hadn't opened. The coffee can was where she put money she was saving for specific emergencies. She had a private hierarchy of emergencies, and right now, her mother's next prescription refill sat at the top of that hierarchy. She did not sleep well. 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon, when the lunch rush had thinned to nothing, and Marcus was mopping the floor in the back, and Elena was rolling silverware at the counter, a man she didn't recognize came through the door. Dark coat, no expression, the same quality of stillness she'd seen on Damien's bodyguards. He placed a white card on the counter without speaking. Same handwriting. Outside. Now. You have 5 minutes before I decide you're not worth waiting for. Elena set down the fork and the napkin. She told Marcus she was taking her break. She took off her apron, folded it, set it on the counter. She walked outside. The black SUV was parked directly in front of the diner. The rear door opened from the inside as she approached. She looked at it for a moment. The open door, the darkness inside. The certainty that getting into that vehicle was the kind of decision that changed the shape of things permanently. She thought about the coffee can. She thought about Dolores. She thought about her mother's hands. She got in. The door closed behind her. Damien Moreau sat on the opposite side, jacket different from before, but same posture, same stillness. No gun visible this time. He was looking at her with that same assessing quality, but there was something different underneath it now. Not warmth, nothing as simple as warmth, but a kind of attention that felt less like categorization and more like genuine study. "You didn't run," he said. "Running where?" Elena said. He almost smiled. "Almost. I bought the diner," he said. 3 days ago. It's yours." Elena stared at him. "I don't want a diner," she said. "You already have one," he said. "The question is what you do with it." The SUV hadn't moved. They were sitting in front of Carla's, her diner, apparently, or whatever it was now, and he laid out the arrangement with the directness of someone describing a business transaction because, to him, that's precisely what it was. The diner would serve as a location, packages occasionally, brief storage, nothing that would draw attention from anyone who didn't already know what to look for. The criminal organizations that competed with his operated on the assumption that valuable things lived in valuable places: warehouses, penthouses, custom armored vehicles. Nobody was watching a broken-down diner in Hell's Kitchen managed by a woman that nobody noticed. "That's what you said," Elena said. "Nobody notices me." "Correct?" "You noticed me." Something shifted in his expression. "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked out the window at the diner, at the flickering neon sign. The C in Carla's had been stuttering for weeks, and she'd never gotten around to reporting it because what was the point? At the cracked vinyl on the booth seats, she could see through the window. At the life she'd been living, compressed into a glass storefront on a street that the city was slowly renovating past her. "What happens if I say no?" she said. "Then you say no," he said, "and I sell the diner, and Bertolucci finds another building manager, and nothing changes for you, except that it does, because I know everything about your situation, and I want you to understand that when I say I can make your problem smaller, I am not making you a promise I don't intend to keep." He told her what he knew. The number. The specific number. Her mother's medical debt, her rent arrears, the amount she owed on a credit card she'd been paying minimum balance on for 2 years. He told her with the measured precision of a man who had done his research thoroughly and wanted her to know it, not as a threat exactly, but as evidence. Evidence that he was serious, evidence that she was visible to him in a way she hadn't been visible to anyone in a long time, even if the visibility was cold and clinical and came packaged inside something she wanted nothing to do with. It was that, the visibility, that made her chest hurt more than the specifics. "One condition," she said. He waited. "Nobody who works here gets hurt. If anything you bring into this building puts any of my people in danger, the deal ends." He looked at her. "Your people," he said, as if the phrase surprised him slightly. "Marcus, the kitchen staff, anyone who works here. They don't know anything, and they stay not knowing anything. That's the condition." He was quiet for a moment, then agreed. She should have asked for more. She knew that sitting there. She should have had a lawyer, which was absurd. She didn't have a lawyer. She could barely afford Dolores. She should have said no. She should have done a lot of things differently, stretching back through years of choices that had compacted into the specific reality of sitting in an armored SUV across from a man whose name people said quietly. But the coffee can was on the top shelf behind the rice, and Dolores came 3 days a week, and Ruth's hands didn't work anymore. "Okay," Elena said. The word cost her something. She felt it leave. She didn't know yet what she'd traded it for. Only that the transaction had been made, and that the life she'd been living, invisible and exhausting and barely held together, was about to become something else entirely. She just didn't know yet if that something else was better or worse. The SUV door opened. She stepped back onto the sidewalk in front of the diner, her diner, and the vehicle pulled away, and she stood there for a moment in the cold October air with her arms crossed and her jaw set and the particular feeling of someone who has just made a decision they can't unmake. She went back inside. She picked up her apron. She tied it around her waist. Marcus looked at her. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," she said. "Who was that?" "Nobody," she said. "Customer." She went back to rolling silverware. Outside, the C and the Carla's sign stuttered twice and went dark. She made a mental note to get it fixed. The first package arrived on a Wednesday. Elena almost missed it. She was in the middle of the breakfast rush, 3 tables demanding refills simultaneously, Marcus burning the first batch of hash browns because he'd been on his phone, the coffee machine making a sound that suggested its days were genuinely numbered now. when a man she didn't recognize came through the back door, the one that opened onto the alley, the one that was supposed to be locked from the outside. He was carrying a canvas duffel bag, dark green, the kind you could buy at any army surplus store in the city, and he set it down behind the dry storage shelves without saying a word and walked back out. Elena watched this happen from across the kitchen. She finished pouring the coffee. She delivered the plates. She waited until the rush thinned to 2 tables before she went to the back and crouched down behind the shelves and looked at the bag without touching it. It was about the size of a loaf of bread, maybe slightly larger. It didn't make any sounds. It didn't smell like anything except canvas and cold air from the alley. She stood up. She went back to work. The bag was gone by the time she locked up at midnight. She didn't see who took it. She found a single white envelope on the shelf where it had been, no name on the outside, and inside a quantity of cash she counted 3 times because the number seemed wrong and then seemed correct and then seemed like something she needed to sit down to process. She sat down on an overturned milk crate in the storage room and held the money and breathed through her nose. She put half of it in the coffee can that night. She paid Dolores's overdue invoice the next morning in cash and absorbed the look Dolores gave her. Not suspicious exactly, but careful. The way a woman who had worked in other people's homes for 20 years learned to be careful about things that didn't quite add up, without explanation. "Your mother had a good night," Dolores said. She was asking about you." "I'll call her tonight," Elena said. "You said that Tuesday." "I'll call her tonight," Elena said again, and left before Dolores could say anything else. She called Tuesday night. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Ruth's voice was thinner than it had been. Or maybe Elena was imagining it, projecting the weight of what she'd started doing onto things that had nothing to do with it. Ruth asked about the diner. Elena said it was going well. Ruth said she was proud of her. Elena said thanks, Mom, and meant it, and hated what she was doing with a precise and focused intensity that she immediately packed away into the box and closed the lid on. The second package came the following Monday. Different man, same back door, same green canvas bag, slightly smaller this time. Elena processed it the same way, didn't touch it, didn't ask questions, went back to work, found the envelope at closing. By the 3rd week, she'd gotten the C in the sign fixed. She'd also had the coffee machine properly serviced by an actual technician rather than her palm, replaced 2 of the worst booth seats, and quietly doubled Marcus's weekly pay without explaining why. Marcus noticed the pay increase immediately. He stood in the kitchen holding his envelope and looking at her with the particular expression of a man who can't decide if something good is actually good. "What's this about?" he said. "You've been here 4 years, Elena said. "You were underpaid." "Bertolucci never thought so." "Bertolucci doesn't own the place anymore." Marcus looked at the envelope, then at her. "Who does?" "I do," she said. Effectively. He was quiet for a moment. Effectively. "It's complicated." "Elena." He set the envelope down on the prep counter. He was a big man, Marcus, soft around the middle now, but with the frame of someone who had been genuinely strong once. And when he lowered his voice, it dropped a full register. "I'm not stupid. I know you're not. Men coming through the back door, you carrying cash, the sign, the seats." He gestured at the kitchen with one hand. The exterminator who showed up and didn't actually do anything. The exterminator had been 2 weeks ago. He'd come in through the front, spent 45 minutes in the back, and left without filing any paperwork or leaving any traps. Elena had understood what he was actually doing, checking the space, measuring, assessing sight lines, but she hadn't known how to explain that to Marcus without explaining everything. "Don't ask me," she said. "I'm asking you." "Marcus," she held his eyes. "I need you to not ask me. What I can tell you is that nothing that comes through that back door has anything to do with you or anyone else on staff. If that ever changes, I will tell you, and I will tell you with enough time for you to make whatever decision you need to make. That's the best I can give you right now." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen smelled like coffee and old grease, the particular smell that had soaked into the walls over decades, and somewhere in the dining room a customer was asking loudly for more butter. "All right," he said finally. He picked the envelope back up. "But you tell me if it changes." "I'll tell you," she said. He went back to the grill. She went back to the floor. Neither of them said anything else about it, and that silence became its own kind of agreement, fragile and necessary. The kind that only holds as long as everyone involved decides to keep holding it. Damien came in for the first time 10 days after the arrangement started. He arrived at 9 p.m. on a Thursday, the slow end of the dinner service, with 2 bodyguards instead of 4, a detail Elena noticed and filed away, unsure of what it meant. He sat at the same center table. He ordered the same black coffee. He looked around the diner with the measuring quality she'd come to recognize, cataloging the new booth seats, the fixed sign, the way Elena had rearranged the counter layout to give herself a better line of sight to both the front door and the kitchen. "You rearranged," he said when she set down the coffee. "Better flow," she said. "Better sight lines," he said. She didn't argue with that. He stayed for 40 minutes. He didn't discuss the arrangement. He didn't discuss anything operational. He ordered the pot roast again, ate most of it, asked one question about whether the Thursday night traffic was typically this light, and listened to her answer with the focused attention of someone taking notes in their head. When he left, he paid in cash, exact change, and left a tip that was more than the meal. She didn't know what to do with that. She put it in the register and thought about it for the rest of the night. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. It became a pattern without either of them naming it as such, the way certain things calcify into routine through simple repetition. He would arrive between 9 and 9:15. He would take the center table. He would order the same things, sometimes with variations, occasionally the steak, once the fish special that Elena had added to the menu after noticing that 3 separate tables had asked for it in 1 week. He would stay between 30 and 50 minutes. He would ask questions, specific questions, not personal, about the diner's operations, supplier relationships, the morning versus evening revenue split, what she'd done to increase the average ticket size, which she had in fact increased by 17% over 6 weeks through a combination of menu adjustments and training. Marcus to suggest additions without being annoying about it. He listened to her answers with a quality of attention she hadn't experienced from anyone in recent memory. Not because the subject matter was interesting to him necessarily, but because she was the one speaking, and he had apparently decided that what she said was worth processing. It made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't entirely categorize. "You negotiated down the produce supplier," he said one Thursday, looking at the handwritten cost breakdown she'd made the mistake of leaving on the counter. "By 18%. 16, she said. "Don't read my notes. You left them on the counter. I set them down for 30 seconds. In front of me." She took the papers back. Say 16%. He was overcharging Bertolucci because Bertolucci never checked. All I did was check. Damien was quiet for a moment. "And the new hire, Yolanda, she's good. She's better than good. Used to work at a diner in the Bronx that had a fire." Elena looked at him. "You ran a background check on my waitress. Standard practice. For the people who work for you, maybe. She works for me." Something sharpened in his expression. "She works for the diner." Same thing. The air between them tightened in the specific way it did when they reached the invisible boundary where business became something else. Not personal, not quite, but adjacent to personal, close enough that neither of them addressed it directly. "She's clean," he said finally, "for what it's worth." "I know she's clean. I hired her." He picked up his coffee. He was almost smiling, that precise, controlled almost smile she'd started to recognize as the outermost edge of what he allowed himself. "You're difficult," he said. It wasn't a complaint exactly. "So I've been told," Elena said, and went to check on table 3. The 4th week, something changed. She noticed it first in the deliveries. The canvas bags came more frequently, twice in 1 week, then 3 times. Then on a Friday night, a different man came through the back and left 2 bags instead of 1. And the second bag was heavier and made a faint sound when it was set down that she told herself was something other than what it probably was. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she called the number on the white card, Damien's direct line, which he'd given her after the second Thursday visit with the instruction to use it only when necessary. She had never used it. She used it now. He answered on the second ring. "The volume is increasing," she said. "We didn't discuss volume. The arrangement is working." I said the volume is increasing. And I said the arrangement is working. His voice was even, unhurried. "Nothing about the terms has changed. The terms didn't account for 2 bags and 1 drop. The terms didn't account for the weight I'm not asking about because I don't want to know, but I know. A pause, shorter than she expected. The frequency will normalize, he said. 2 weeks. And if it doesn't? Another pause, longer this time. Then we renegotiate, he said. But it will. She didn't believe him entirely. She wasn't sure he expected her to. She hung up and stood in her kitchen at 7 in the morning with the phone in her hand and the particular feeling of someone standing on a surface that has quietly begun to slope without anyone announcing the change in grade. She went to work. The 2 weeks passed. The frequency did not normalize. It stabilized at 3 drops per week, which was more than 1 and less than the Friday spike, and represented a steady escalation that Damien had apparently decided constituted acceptable middle ground. Elena said nothing more about it. She had made her protest. She had received her answer. She understood now. And the understanding arrived with a cold, clear quality she didn't particularly welcome. That the conversation she'd had in the SUV 6 weeks ago had not actually established a partnership with negotiable terms. It had established a structure in which she operated within tolerances he set, and the tolerances could move, and her job was to function effectively within wherever they moved to. She started keeping notes, not about the bags. She wasn't going to document that she wasn't an idiot, but about everything else. The diner's finances, the supplier relationships, the staff schedules, the revenue patterns. She built a detailed picture of the business that she kept in a notebook at home, locked in the same drawer as her lease. She told herself this was good practice. She told herself it had nothing to do with the growing recognition that she needed to understand exactly what she was managing and what it was worth, because at some point that information would matter in ways she couldn't yet fully define. One Thursday night, 6 weeks into the arrangement, a man she'd never seen before sat down across from Damien at the center table. This had never happened. The center table was always Damien's alone. His bodyguards took the peripheral positions, near the door, near the window. But they didn't sit with him. Nobody sat with him. This man sat across from him like they were equals, which meant either they were or the man didn't know enough to be afraid. And looking at him, Elena thought it was probably the former. He was older than Damien by 15 years at minimum, thinner, with the kind of stillness that came not from training, but from long practice in rooms where stillness was a survival mechanism. He didn't look around the diner when he sat down. He looked directly at Damien and nowhere else. Elena took their order. The man wanted only water, Damien the usual, and withdrew to the counter and watched in her peripheral vision the way you watch something that you're not supposed to be watching. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. She couldn't hear it. Damien's posture changed during it in ways she'd learned to read. A slight forward lean at one point, then a deliberate settling back, a specific quality of stillness that she now understood meant he was controlling his reaction to something he hadn't anticipated. At the end of 20 minutes, the older man stood up and left without looking at anyone. He didn't touch his water. Damien sat for another 5 minutes. Then he called her over with a look, not a gesture, just a look, which she had also learned meant something different from his usual Thursday night manner. She came over. "Sit down," he said. She looked at him. "I don't sit with customers." "Sit down, Elena." She sat down. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and she filed that away too, behind everything else she was filing. "There's going to be a change in the schedule," he said. "Starting this week, I need you available Monday evenings, after close." "Available how?" "The back room. I need to use it for a meeting. 2 hours, maximum." Elena thought about the back room. She'd turned it into a small office, a desk, a filing cabinet, a chair she'd bought secondhand, a working lamp. It was the one space in the diner that felt like hers in a way the rest of it didn't quite manage. "Who's the meeting with?" "People you don't need to know about." "If they're in my back room, I need to know about them." His jaw moved slightly. "They're not your concern." "My building, my concern." "Elena." He said it in the way people said a name when they were choosing between 2 different versions of the same sentence. "This is not a negotiation." She looked at him across the table. The diner was quiet now. The last table had paid and left while they were sitting, and Marcus was doing the closing checklist in the kitchen, and somewhere outside a siren rose and fell and faded. "You told me I had control of this place," she said. "You do." Then I'm exercising it. You want the back room Monday nights? I need to know who's coming through. And if I tell you that's not possible, then we have a problem. The silence between them had a weight now that the earlier silences hadn't carried. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held it, because looking away was still not an option she was willing to take. Caruso, he said finally. The name came out like it cost something. Vincent Caruso. He represents interests that overlap with mine in ways that are currently being renegotiated. She'd heard the name. Caruso. The Moretti family's second-tier management, the layer between the bosses and the street. If Damien was meeting with someone from the Moretti structure privately, inside a diner in Hell's Kitchen, it meant the renegotiation was the kind that didn't have lawyers present. All right, she said. All right, he repeated as if he hadn't expected her to drop it that cleanly. I won't be in the back room, but I'll be in the building. She held his eyes. That's my condition. He looked at her for another long moment, then he nodded. Once, and that was that. The Monday meeting happened. Then another. Then a third. Elena closed the diner, sent Marcus home, stayed in the kitchen with the lights low, and the back room occupied by men whose conversation she could hear only as muffled shapes through the wall, the rhythm of voices negotiating something, the specific cadences of tension and compromise, and once, a raised voice that went immediately quiet in a way that sounded like someone had made a physical gesture to end it. After the third meeting, Damien lingered at the back door while his men cleared out. Elena was restocking the condiment station and did not turn around. You're not curious, he said. I'm extremely curious, she said. I'm also not stupid. Those aren't the same thing. No, but they're related. She turned around. He was standing at the back door with his jacket over his arm, which she'd never seen. He always wore the jacket, always buttoned, and the fact of it over his arm made him look for one brief and disorienting moment like someone who was tired. How's it going? She said. The renegotiation. He looked at her. Not your concern. You're using my building. Something moved in his expression. Badly, he said finally. It's going badly. She nodded. She turned back to the condiments. He left. She heard the back door close behind him. That night, she lay in her apartment and looked at the ceiling and understood something clearly for the first time. The trouble that was coming was not the kind you could see from a distance and navigate around. It was the kind that built underneath you, structural, invisible, until the floor dropped, and by the time you understood what was happening, you were already falling. She thought about the terms she'd agreed to in the SUV. She thought about the bags she didn't ask about, and the meetings she didn't attend, and the money in the coffee can that was now substantial enough to make a real difference in her mother's situation. Not solved, not fixed, but meaningfully different from where it had been 2 months ago. She thought about Marcus saying, I'm not stupid. She thought about the older man who'd sat across from Damien and left without touching his water. She thought about the raised voice in the back room that had gone quiet too fast. She was still awake at 3 a.m. when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it because she'd learned in the last 2 months that unknown numbers required answering. The voice on the other end was a man she didn't recognize. He spoke quietly, almost gently, with the specific gentleness of someone communicating something that should have been frightening but was being delivered carefully because the delivery was part of the message. Ms. Mercer, he said, you don't know me, but I know quite a lot about you, about the diner, about the arrangement you've made with Damien Moreau. A pause. I want you to understand that the arrangement you believe you have is not the arrangement that exists. And when what's actually happening becomes clear to you, and it will very soon, I want you to remember that there are other options available, that not everyone in this situation is your enemy. She said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, who is this? A concerned party, the man said. Get some sleep, Miss Mercer. You're going to need it. The line went dead. She sat up in bed and held the phone and looked at the dark window across from her and felt the specific sensation of something that had been quietly assembling itself in the dark, piece by piece, night by night, finally reaching critical mass, not yet visible, not yet exploded, but present in the room with her like a pressure change before a storm, the moment when the air itself becomes the warning. She didn't sleep after that. She lay there with her eyes open until the gray light came through the window and the city began to make its morning sounds, and she made a decision she couldn't entirely name yet. Something to do with paying closer attention and trusting no one and keeping the notebook updated, because whatever was coming, she was going to face it with every detail she could carry. And somewhere across the city, in a building she'd never been to, a man named Vincent Caruso made a phone call that would change the shape of everything. She didn't know about that call yet, but in 6 days, she would. 6 days. That was how long it took for Vincent Caruso's phone call to become something she could see with her own eyes. It was a Tuesday, not a Thursday, which meant Damien wasn't there, which she understood later was not an accident. The diner had closed at 11. Marcus had left by 11:15. Elena was alone in the kitchen doing the last of the closing inventory when she heard the back door open, and she turned around expecting one of the regular drop men, the one with the green canvas bags and the practiced blankness of someone who had learned to exist in the periphery of things. Instead, it was a man she recognized from the Monday meetings, not Caruso. One of Caruso's men. She'd seen him twice through the cracked kitchen door during the backroom sessions, a lean man in his 40s with a scar that ran from his left ear toward his jaw and stopped about an inch short of it, like whatever had made it had been interrupted. He'd always been in the background during those meetings, standing near the wall, and she'd cataloged him the way she cataloged everything now, automatically, without deciding to. He was not in the background now. He was standing in her kitchen with a sealed package in both hands. Not a canvas bag this time, but a flat, rigid case, black, the kind used for equipment. And he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, but that contained something she didn't like. Something that was neither hostile nor friendly, but occupying an uncomfortable space between those two things. "Mr. Caruso sends this," he said, and set the case on the prep counter. Elena didn't move toward it. "Nobody told me about a drop tonight." "Unscheduled?" he said. "Everything that comes through that door is scheduled. That was the arrangement." "Arrangements change, Ms. Mercer." He said her name with a precision that made the hair on the back of her neck do something. "Mr. Caruso asks that you hold this until Friday. Someone will collect it." "Someone Moreau sent?" A pause that was 2 beats too long. "Someone authorized," he said. She looked at the case. She looked at him. Her hands were at her sides, and she was aware of the weight of the cast-iron skillet hanging on the hook 3 feet to her left, which was not a thought she'd have had 2 months ago, and the fact that she was having it now told her something about what the last 2 months had done to the way she processed a room. "I need to verify this with Moreau," she said. "Mr. Caruso prefers you don't do that." "I'm sure he does." She kept her voice flat. "I'm doing it anyway." The man's expression shifted. Not toward threat exactly, but the space between them changed, and she understood that he was calculating something. Her distance from the door, his distance from her, the variables of a situation that had not gone the direction he'd expected. "Ms. Mercer," he said carefully, "this is a professional courtesy between parties. It doesn't require Moreau's involvement. Everything in this building requires Moreau's involvement. That's the arrangement I'm in, not yours." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked the case back up, and something about the way he did it, the deliberateness of it, the decision in the gesture, made her understand that he was recalibrating, that this conversation had produced data he was going to take somewhere and process. "Friday," he said, "you'll be contacted." He left through the back door. She heard his footsteps in the alley, fading. She stood in the kitchen for 30 seconds without moving. Then she took her phone out of her apron pocket and called the number. Damien answered on the 3rd ring, which was longer than usual. "There was a man in my kitchen tonight," she said. "Scar on his jaw. One of Caruso's." The silence on the other end lasted exactly long enough to confirm that this was information he hadn't expected. "What did he want?" "He left a case. Said Caruso wanted me to hold it until Friday, said someone authorized would collect it. He specifically asked me not to call you." Another silence. Longer this time and with a different quality. Dense, processing. The sound of a man revising his understanding of something in real time. "What did you do with the case?" "He took it back when I said I was calling you." The silence that followed that statement was the longest yet. When Damien spoke again, his voice had not changed in tone or volume, but something underneath the tone had changed. Some baseline that she'd learned to read without being able to fully articulate what she was reading. "Don't open the diner tomorrow," he said. "I have a full staff scheduled. Call them. Family emergency, equipment failure, whatever you want. Close the diner tomorrow. A pause. I'll be there Thursday. What's happening? Thursday, he said, and hung up. She stood in the empty kitchen with the phone in her hand and the overhead fluorescents buzzing their particular frequency above her, and thought about the case. Flat and rigid and black, and the specific way the man had held it, carefully, both hands, the kind of carefulness that wasn't about weight, but about contents. She didn't sleep that night either. She was developing a pattern. Wednesday, she closed the diner, told Marcus the walk-in refrigeration unit had failed and she was waiting on a repair technician, which was a lie Marcus accepted with a look that communicated clearly. He understood it was a lie, but was choosing to accept it. She spent the day in her apartment with the notebook and tried to map what she knew against what she suspected, which was a frustrating exercise because the spaces between the two were large and poorly lit. What she knew, Caruso was from the Moretti structure. Damien had been meeting with him Monday nights, privately, in her back room. Caruso's man had tried to use her building for an unscheduled drop without Damien's knowledge, and had specifically requested she not inform Damien. The drop had been a rigid case, not the canvas bags that came through on Damien's schedule. What she suspected, the Monday meetings were not going well. Damien had told her that himself, or as close to himself as he ever got. Caruso was operating outside whatever framework the meetings were supposed to establish. The unscheduled drop was either a test of her loyalties or an attempt to install something inside the building that Damien didn't know about. The third option, the one she wrote down and then sat looking at for a long time, was that the drop wasn't for storage at all, that the case being placed in the diner and collected Friday was a setup for something that happened between Wednesday and Friday, something she'd be standing in the middle of without knowing she was standing in the middle of it. She underlined that option. She didn't know what to do with it yet. Thursday night, Damien arrived at 8 instead of 9. He came through the front door with 4 bodyguards, not 2, which was the configuration she associated with the first night he'd walked in, when she hadn't yet meant anything to his operation, when she'd been just a woman in a diner that happened to have a gun pressed to her chest. He sat at the center table. He didn't order anything. She came over and stood across from him. "Sit down," he said. She sat down. She'd stopped performing the resistance to sitting with him weeks ago. It had become something they both understood was the position from which they dealt with things directly, and the performance of distance was a waste of both their time. "Caruso's man," he said. "Describe the case." She described it. He listened with his hands flat on the table, very still, the way he went still when the information he was receiving required full processing resources. "And he said Friday," Damien said. "Someone authorized." "His word, not yours." He looked at her. "Not mine," he agreed. "What was in it?" His jaw moved slightly. "I don't know yet." The admission cost him something. She could see it in the way he said it, the specific flatness of a man who was unaccustomed to not knowing things inside his own operation. "But I have a reasonable theory." "Are you going to tell me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a cab horn sounded and faded, and the neon sign, the repaired C burning steady now, threw red light across the table between them. "Caruso has been communicating with Reyes," he said. She didn't know the name, but something about the way he said it told her she should. "Reyes runs the Eastern distribution for the Moretti family," he said. "He's been trying to consolidate Moretti's position for 2 years. Caruso was supposed to be acting as intermediary, working both sides of the negotiation, bringing terms to me that Moretti was willing to accept." He paused. "He wasn't doing that." "He was feeding them your position," Elena said. "He was feeding them my timeline, my capacity assessments, specifically," and here something moved behind his eyes, a controlled version of something she suspected was significantly less controlled on the inside. "The locations I use for storage and transit." The sentence landed on the table between them, and she understood its full weight within about 3 seconds. "He told them about the diner," she said. "Yes." "How long ago?" "At least 3 weeks, possibly 4. 3 weeks. The bags had been coming 3 times a week for a month. So everything that's been stored here, they know about it. The Moretti people know this location. They've known it." He looked at her with the full weight of what that meant. The drop Caruso's man tried to make Wednesday night was not storage. "A marker," she said, and heard the flatness in her own voice. "Something to confirm the location, or trigger something. More likely a device, he said, something that would tell them what was here when they came for it. The word when sat there. They're coming, she said. Not a question. Not if I can prevent it. Damien. She leaned forward slightly, and it was the first time she'd used his name without the buffer of his title or a pronoun, and they both registered it. When? He looked at her. His expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. The controlled surface of it cracked. Not much. A hairline fracture, but enough. I don't know the timeline, he said, which means I can't guarantee your safety in this building past. The front window exploded inward. It wasn't one shot. It was several, close together, and the sound was enormous in the enclosed space. Not the clean bang of a single report, but a tearing cascade that took out the glass in a diagonal line and sent it across the nearest booth in a glittering wave. Elena was on the floor before she understood she'd moved, operating on something below thought, pure physical response. And she heard Damien's bodyguards shouting and the overturning of furniture and then the front door. She heard the front door open. Not blow in, but open, which meant someone had been close enough to open it. Her cheek was against the tile. The tile was cold. She could see the underside of the counter from this angle, the old gum and scuff marks of years of feet. The detail of it absurd and precise in the way details become when your body has flooded itself with adrenaline and your brain is processing everything it can reach. She heard a voice she didn't recognize, commanding something, and a bodyguard answering, and then a sound she absolutely recognized, the specific crack and grunt of someone being hit hard and going down. And then someone was grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet, and it was not Damien, it was the bodyguard from the door, and he was moving her toward the kitchen with a grip that didn't allow for conversation. She didn't fight it, she moved. And in the kitchen, she understood the situation in about 4 seconds of rapid assessment. The front of the diner was compromised, the bodyguard was bleeding from a cut above his eye and moving her toward the back door, and she could hear from the dining room the voices of at least 3 men she didn't recognize. The bodyguard reached for the back door handle. Wait, she said. He looked at her. That's what they want, she said. The alley. It's the natural exit. If they planned this, she didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to, because he was a professional, and the logic arrived in his face as quickly as it had arrived in hers. He stepped back from the door. They looked at each other across the small kitchen. She thought fast. The kitchen had 2 positions that weren't exits. The walk-in refrigerator and the space behind the industrial fryer unit, which was large, generating heat, and positioned in the corner in a way that gave a sight line to the kitchen door without requiring her to be visible from it. She pointed. He nodded. They moved. She pressed herself into the narrow space behind the fryer with the wall against her back, and the heat from the unit was immediate and aggressive, and she could feel sweat starting at her hairline almost instantly. The bodyguard took the opposite corner. They waited. The kitchen door opened. 2 men came through, not the scar-faced man from Wednesday, different, younger, carrying themselves with the specific loose readiness of people who had done this before. They didn't turn the kitchen lights on, which told her they'd scoped the space or had a layout. Elena's hand found the edge of the fryer basket, the long-handled mesh basket hanging on the hook beside the unit, heavy steel, commercial grade. She didn't pull it down. She held it. She waited. The first man moved toward the walk-in. He opened it and looked in, and she understood they were searching, clearing the space methodically. The second man was moving toward her corner. He was 4 feet away. 3. She pulled the fryer basket off the hook in one motion and swung it horizontal with everything she had, and it connected with the side of his head with the sound she felt through her hands, and he went down hard. And before the first man could finish turning around, she'd crossed the kitchen and driven the basket's handle into his solar plexus. And when he doubled forward, she slammed his face into the edge of the prep counter. He went to his knees. She was breathing. She could hear herself breathing loud in the kitchen, each breath a conscious event. The door to the dining room burst open, and she grabbed the industrial oil canister from beside the fryer. A full commercial container of vegetable oil, 8 pounds, handle on top. And she threw it directly at the man in the doorway and then hit the fire suppression discharge on the wall before he could recover his footing. And the kitchen filled instantly with chemical fog, and the shouting became directionless. She dropped to her knees where the air was cleaner, moved toward the fallen man near the prep counter. found his weapon by feel in the fog and pulled it, and held it in hands that were shaking now, genuinely shaking. The adrenaline having reached some peak and begun converting itself into the physical vibration of a body that had done something it was not built to sustain. She heard Damien's voice from the dining room, calling her name, once, sharp. She answered, one word. Kitchen. The fog began to settle. The man by the prep counter was not moving. The man she'd hit with the basket was on his side with his hands at his head, conscious but not functional. The man in the doorway was gone. Retreated, she understood, into the dining room, which meant someone had met him there. She stayed low. She waited. It was 11 minutes before the kitchen door opened again, and it was Damien who came through, and the expression on his face when he saw her crouched in the settling chemical fog with a weapon in shaking hands and the two men on the floor of her kitchen was an expression she had no category for. He looked at the men. He looked at her. He looked at the fryer basket on the floor. "You," he said, and stopped. He seemed to be doing the same thing she was doing, running the assessment, cataloging the outputs. "They went out the front," she said, meaning the surviving attackers. "We know," he said. "Are you hurt?" She checked, cataloged. "No." He crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of her and looked at her face with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, intense and assessing, but closer than he'd ever been. Close enough that she could see the cut on his cheekbone that had dripped once and dried. "You need to stand up," he said. "I know." She stood up. Her legs were fine. She was surprised her legs were fine. He straightened. He looked at the two men on the floor of her kitchen with an expression she recognized now as the precursor to decision, the specific quality of a man who is calculating consequences and outcomes and landing on a course of action. "Caruso's it," he said. Not a question. "His man wasn't here," Elena said. "But yes, this didn't happen accidentally." "No," Damien said. "It didn't." He looked at her. "My lieutenant, Garrett, he was the one who told Caruso about this location." The name dropped into the room. "Garrett," she said. "You're trusted?" "Yes." The word was clipped. "He set this up. He sold the location, the schedule, the drop patterns, everything." His jaw was tight. "He's been working with Reyes for 3 months. Tonight was supposed to be both of us, in one location, simultaneously." She absorbed that. Both of them. Her and Damien, in the diner, on a Thursday night when Damien was present, a night that Garrett would have known about because Garrett knew everything about Damien's schedule. "He knew you came here Thursdays," she said. "Yes?" "He sent you here tonight. The meeting you had earlier, I requested it," Damien said. "But Garrett confirmed the location." Something moved in his face, not shame exactly, but a close relative of it, the specific expression of a man who has understood the mechanism of his own betrayal. "He confirmed it to me and then confirmed it to Reyes." The kitchen was quiet. The chemical fog had mostly settled. The fluorescent light above them buzzed its frequency, and somewhere in the dining room, someone was on a radio. Elena looked at her hands. They were still shaking faintly. She consciously stopped them, closing her fists and releasing them twice, and the shaking diminished, but didn't entirely stop. "What happens now?" she said. It wasn't a question about tonight specifically. Damien looked at her. "Now," he said, "you are a target, formally. Not a bystander, not a location, a target." She'd known that was coming. She'd known it from the moment she'd picked up the fryer basket. The line she'd been telling herself existed, the one between the diner being used and her being part of what it was used for. That line was lying on her kitchen floor with 2 of Reyes's men. "My staff," she said. "I'll make arrangements. Marcus, I'll handle it." "You'll handle it how?" "Elena." His voice was not unkind. It was simply certain, in the way of someone who has seen more iterations of this situation than they should have. "I will handle it. That is not the problem you need to focus on right now." She looked at him. "What is?" He held her eyes and said the things she already knew but needed to hear someone say out loud, in words, in her kitchen, with 2 men on her floor and broken glass in her dining room and her hands that wouldn't quite stop. "Garrett is still out there," he said, "and Reyes knows tonight failed. which means they'll try again, faster this time, because a failed operation is a liability. He paused. There is no version of the next 72 hours in which you go back to the life you had yesterday. She already knew that. She'd known it the moment she'd thrown the oil canister. Maybe she'd known it the moment she'd gotten into the black SUV, or the moment she'd picked up the $1,000 from under the tablecloth. Or earlier, the moment she'd looked into Damien Moreau's eyes with a gun against her chest and chosen not to look away. The version of Elena Mercer who could choose not to be involved had stopped existing somewhere in the last 2 months. Tonight just filed the paperwork. All right, she said. He looked at her with that unreadable expression. All right, he repeated. Tell me what you need from me. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Garrett, he doesn't know you were here tonight. He doesn't know you survived. We have maybe 18 hours before Reyes tells him the operation failed, and in those 18 hours, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his face changed completely, in a way she'd never seen it change, and she understood that whatever the call was, it was not part of any calculation he'd made tonight. He answered. He listened. He said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he said very quietly, When? Another silence. How many? He said. He listened to the answer. He lowered the phone. He looked at Elena with an expression she would remember for a long time afterward. Not fear. Damien Moreau did not appear to experience fear in any conventional form, but something adjacent to it, something that was fear's more practical cousin. The look of a man who has just understood that the board has been flipped and every piece is in a different position than he believed, and he is recalculating from zero. That was my second in command, he said. Garrett didn't just sell the location. He paused. He sold everything, my primary operation, the warehouse on the west side, 3 transit routes. Another pause, shorter. And he's gone. Left the city, we think, 2 hours ago. She stared at him. Reyes doesn't just know about this diner, Damien said. He knows about everything, and he's moving tonight while we're standing in your kitchen. He looked at her with the full weight of it. I need to go, right now. Then go, she said. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the way he'd looked at her the first night, the way that had felt like categorization but now felt like something else, something she still didn't have clean language for. Come with me, he said. She looked at the kitchen, her kitchen. The broken glass she could hear settling in the dining room, the coffee machine that had been broken for 11 days and that she'd fixed and that worked now, the staff roster on the clipboard by the door with Marcus's name at the top. If I leave this building with you, she said, I don't come back to what it was. No, he said. You don't. She looked at him. She breathed once, steadily, through her nose. Then she took off her apron, folded it, and set it on the prep counter for the last time. The SUV moved fast through empty streets. Elena sat in the back with Damien and said nothing for the first 4 blocks because there was nothing useful to say yet, and she'd learned, in the last 2 months, that the space before information arrived was not a space to fill with noise. Her hands had stopped shaking. She wasn't sure when exactly. Somewhere between taking off her apron and getting into the vehicle, the shaking had simply stopped, replaced by a stillness that felt less like calm and more like the particular quiet of something that has made its decision and is now only waiting for the execution. She was still in her work clothes. She had nothing with her, no bag, no jacket, no notebook. The notebook was in her apartment in the locked drawer with her lease, and her apartment felt like it belonged to a different version of her life than the one currently moving through Hell's Kitchen at 11:40 on a Thursday night. Damien was on the phone. He'd been on the phone since they left the diner, moving between calls in rapid succession, each conversation short and tightly coded in a way that she could follow the architecture of without understanding the content. He was assessing damage. He was repositioning people. He was doing what she imagined a general did when the battle map stopped matching the battlefield, working backward from the new reality with whatever pieces he still had on the board. His second call ended and he looked at her. The warehouse on the west side, he said. Reyes hit it 40 minutes ago. Our people got out. The inventory didn't. She processed that. How bad? Significant. His jaw tightened. 3 transit routes are compromised. The drivers have been contacted. 2 responded, 1 hasn't. The one who hasn't responded. We're finding out. The SUV turned north. She looked out the window at the city moving past. The particular New York mixture of darkness and light, storefronts closed and restaurants still lit, figures on corners that the city produced at all hours, the whole dense machine of it continuing to operate in complete indifference to whatever was unraveling inside it. "Where are we going?" she said. "Secure location. I have 4 of them in rotation. Reyes knows about one. Garrett would have known that one specifically because I used it twice in the last month for meetings Garrett attended." He paused. "So we're going to one of the other 3. How do you know Garrett only knew about one?" He looked at her. The question had landed somewhere useful, and they both knew it. "I don't," he said after a moment. "Then we shouldn't go to any of them." The silence in the SUV had a specific texture. "She's right," said the bodyguard in the front passenger seat, the one with the cut above his eye from the diner. He said it carefully, the way a man said something to his employer that he expected might not be welcome. Damien looked at Elena for 3 seconds. Then he said something to the driver in a low voice, and the SUV's direction changed. "We need to talk about Garrett," Elena said. "We'll talk about Garrett when we're... now." She turned to face him directly. "You told me he left the city 2 hours ago. 2 hours before the hit on the diner, 2 hours before the warehouse. He coordinated both simultaneously from outside the city, which means someone inside is still running the operation for Reyes." Damien was very still. "Garrett's gone," she said. "But the information he sold is being used by someone with enough operational knowledge to hit 2 locations in the same hour. That's not Reyes directing remotely. That's someone on the ground who knows your people's patterns." "Caruso," Damien said. "Or someone below Caruso who knows more than Caruso does." She paused. "Who confirmed the drop schedule at the diner?" "Not to you. To Garrett." "Who confirmed the specific Thursday pattern?" He looked at her. His expression was doing the thing she'd learned meant he was running calculations he didn't want to run because the outputs were unpleasant. "2 people knew the Thursday schedule," he said slowly. "Garrett and my operations coordinator, a man named Delon." "Where's Delon right now?" He picked up his phone. The call rang 6 times and went to voicemail. In the front seat, the bodyguard with the cut eye reached forward and turned off the dome light without being asked, and the interior of the SUV went dark except for the ambient light of the city through the windows, and nobody said anything for a moment. "Pull over," Damien said. The driver pulled over on a side street in the upper 30s. The engine idled. Outside, the street was quiet. "Talk," Damien said, and he was looking at Elena when he said it, which meant he wanted her to keep going, to follow the thread she'd pulled. "The failed drop Wednesday night," she said. "Caruso's man came to the diner with the case. He knew I'd call you if anything felt wrong because I'd demonstrated that already. So either he came expecting to get past me, which means he thought I was more controllable than I am, or..." She stopped, thought it through one more step. "Or him coming to the diner wasn't the actual operation. It was a test. He came to see what I'd do, to confirm to Reyes's people whether I was a liability or an asset they could potentially use." Damien's expression had gone very still. "They weren't trying to leave something in the building," she said. "They were reading me, deciding if I was someone they could work with or someone who needed to be in the diner when they hit it tonight." "And when you called me," Damien said, "they got their answer." She paused. "I made myself a target by being loyal to you. They knew I'd be in the building tonight. The hit wasn't just about you." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. The 2 words hit her differently than she expected, not because of what they meant, but because of the quality with which he said them. The absence of distance in them. The fact that he was not managing the information or framing it or delivering it with the careful control he applied to most things. He just said it. He knew. He'd known, probably, the moment his phone rang in the kitchen, and he'd understood the full scope of what Garrett had sold. He'd looked at her and said, "Come with me," knowing she was already a target. She filed that away. Now was not the time to process it. "Delon," she said, "if he's the inside man, he knows every move you make in the next 12 hours. Every contact you reach out to, every location you consider, every resource you try to activate." "Which means I can't use any of my normal channels," Damien said. "Which means you're operating blind." "Not entirely." He looked at the bodyguard in the front seat. "Ren, who do you trust? Not who I trust. Who do you trust, personally?" "Ren," the bodyguard, was quiet for a moment. 4 people, he said, none of them in your primary structure. Call them. Use your phone, not the operation line. He looked at Elena. And you. She looked at him. You saw something in the diner, before the hit. You told me you started keeping notes. She had never told him about the notebook. She'd told no one about the notebook. The fact that he knew meant he'd either had her watched or he'd inferred it from the quality of information she'd demonstrated over the past 2 months. The specific kind of observation that only happened when someone was recording and reviewing, not just noticing. Not here, she said. What are you looking for? The delivery schedules you mentioned, the first night we discussed the Monday meetings. He was leaning forward slightly. You said something about a pattern in the deliveries. You said it made no sense unless it was coordinating with something else. She had said that. 6 days ago, in her kitchen after one of the Monday meetings, she'd mentioned offhand that the drop patterns at the diner had a secondary rhythm she couldn't explain by storage logic alone. Something about the timing relative to the days of the week, the specific windows when drops came versus when they were collected. I said it might be coordinating with a transit schedule, she said. Not a Moreau transit schedule, something external, commercial. What did you think it was? I thought it was a freight corridor. The timing matched a commercial delivery window for the blocks east of the diner. There's a consolidated shipping hub 4 streets over that runs heavy trucks between 2 and 4 a.m., Thursday through Sunday. Damien looked at her. That's a Reyes operation, he said quietly. The shipping hub. He's owned it through a front company for 8 months. She absorbed that. So the drops at my diner weren't just storage. They were transfer points, he said. What came through the back door went out through the alley and into Reyes' freight corridor on the same night. Garrett set it up. He was feeding both of us, taking my product through your building and transitioning it into Reyes' network. The scope of it settled over the interior of the SUV like a temperature drop. For how long? She said. From the beginning, he said. From the beginning. The first green canvas bag, the first envelope of cash. The whole architecture of the arrangement she'd been operating inside, the part she'd known about and the much larger part she hadn't, had been, from the first Wednesday morning, a mechanism that served Damien's stated purposes and simultaneously served an entirely different set of purposes she'd had no knowledge of. She thought about the coffee can, the money she'd put into it, the prescription she'd paid for, Dolores's overdue invoice. She thought about where that money had actually come from and what it had actually been for. I need a minute, she said. Elena, 1 minute. She looked at the window, the street outside. A woman walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk, the dog stopping at every lamppost with the patient thoroughness of an animal that had nowhere else to be. Normal city, normal night, the whole indifferent apparatus of New York continuing its business. She took the minute. She used it to find the line between what she could do something about and what she couldn't, to put on one side of it the fact that she'd been used in ways she hadn't consented to, and on the other side of it the fact that being angry about that right now served no function. She could be angry about it later. She could be angry about it when there was a later. She turned back. The shipping hub, she said. If it's a Reyes operation, that's where he coordinates from. It's not just freight. I know. If Dellin is compromised and Garrett is gone and Reyes has hit both your primary locations tonight, he's expecting you to go to ground, to consolidate, protect what's left. Wait. Standard response, Damien said, which means he's prepared for standard response. He has people covering your retreat options, watching your known contacts, waiting for you to surface through the channels he's already mapped. She paused. He's not prepared for you to move toward him. The silence in the SUV was a different kind of silence than any of the previous ones. Ren in the front seat had gone very still. The driver was looking straight ahead. Damien looked at her. The hub. You know the location. He doesn't know you know it. He thinks that information is yours through your operation. And Garrett would have told him that corridor was never traced back to Reyes through your intelligence. She held his eyes. He thinks you don't know where he's running from. You figured out the shipping corridor from delivery schedules, Damien said slowly. I figured it out from the timing of arrivals and exits at the back of my diner and a freight timetable I found taped to the wall at the supply depot I use for the diner's kitchen orders. She paused. Garrett didn't know that. He didn't tell Reyes because he didn't know I'd made the connection. Something shifted in Damien's expression. The hairline fracture she'd seen in the diner widened briefly into something that was almost, not hope exactly, but the operational cousin of it, the specific quality of a man who has found one variable that his opponent hasn't accounted for. If we move on the hub tonight, he said, we have maybe a 2-hour window before Reyes understands that the standard response isn't coming. 90 minutes, she said. 2 hours is optimistic. He'll start getting nervous when your known contacts stop responding. 90 minutes, he agreed. He looked at Ren. Who are your 4 people? Can they move tonight? Yes, Ren said. How many can Reyes have at that location? Unknown, but a coordination hub running freight with a full operation active tonight. Ren paused. Significant. Enough to expect a response if things go wrong. But not enough to expect an offensive, Elena said. Not from Moreau. Not on a night when Moreau's entire operation just got hit in 2 locations. Ren looked at her. Not hostile. Something more like reassessment. She's right, he said again. Damien made the decision the way she'd seen him make decisions. Not visibly, not with announcement, just a quality of settlement that came over him, the cessation of the calculating and the beginning of the forward motion. Move, he said to the driver. The SUV pulled back into traffic. It took 40 minutes to get to the waterfront and another 10 to position. Ren's 4 people met them in a parking structure 3 blocks from the shipping hub. They arrived in 2 vehicles, moved fast, said very little, had the specific compact readiness of people who had been called out of sleep and were not angry about it because this was the life they'd agreed to. She watched them gear up in the low light of the parking structure and understood, for the first time in a fully embodied rather than intellectual way, what the world she'd agreed to 7 weeks ago actually looked like when its clothes came off. Damien put his hand on her arm before they moved out. Not grasping, just contact. You stay in the vehicle with the driver. I'm the one who mapped the location. You've done your part. Damien. She said it the same way she'd said it in the kitchen. He looked at her. I'm the one who identified the hub. I know the freight corridor layout because I tracked the truck movements for 2 weeks. You have 9 people and you're walking into a location of unknown size. She paused. I know which direction the trucks exit. I know the timing window. If Reyes's people try to move anything out when this starts, I know where they'll go. He looked at her for 3 seconds. South exit, she said. The trucks always exit south, then west on the service road, then onto the freight corridor proper. If they move anything during your entry, it goes that direction. Someone needs to be there. The driver? The driver doesn't know what he's looking for. I do. He looked at her for another long moment. The parking structure was quiet, except for the distant sound of the waterfront. Water moving, the low machinery sounds of a working port at midnight. South exit, he said. You observe. You don't engage. If anything comes out, you call Ren. Understood. He held her eyes for 1 more second, and there was something in that second that neither of them put into words, because the words would have taken longer than the situation allowed, and they both understood that. And then he looked away and the group moved out. She moved to the south exit position with the driver, a young man named Cole, who drove with focused precision and had not asked a single question since she'd gotten into the SUV. And they parked on the service road with the engine running and the lights off, and she watched the dark bulk of the shipping hub through the windshield and listened. The first sounds came 12 minutes after the group moved in. Not gunshots, not yet, but a series of industrial sounds, metal against metal, the kind of commotion that a working freight hub produced, amplified by the specific quality of things going wrong inside it. She could see lights moving behind the hub's narrow, high windows, sweeping and irregular, not the steady movement of normal operations. Then the gunfire started. It was not like the diner. In the diner, the sounds had been enormous and close, and she'd been inside them. From outside the hub, the sounds had a different quality, flattened by distance and the thick walls of the building, a staccato series of reports that she tracked with the focused attention of someone who couldn't do anything about them and therefore could only listen for what they meant. She counted. She breathed. She watched the south exit. Cole said nothing. He had both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the building, and the quality of stillness he projected was either professional calm or something he was performing extremely well. 7 minutes into the gunfire, the south exit doors opened. 2 vehicles came out fast. Not the freight trucks. Smaller, black, moving with the urgent acceleration of a retreat rather than the deliberate pace of a scheduled exit. They hit the service road doing 40 and turned west exactly as she'd said they would. She called Wren. 2 vehicles, south exit, going west on the service road now. Copy. The sound behind Wren's voice was not quiet. Is Damien, he's in. Go. She looked at Cole. Follow them. He followed them. The service road ran along the waterfront for a quarter mile before connecting to the main freight corridor and then to the broader street grid. In daylight, it would have been a straightforward tale. At midnight, with the service road dark and the 2 vehicles moving fast and Cole maintaining a gap that was professional without being instructed to, it was possible to follow without being seen. Possible, not certain. The lead vehicle was a dark sedan. The second was an SUV, heavier, lower on its chassis, which meant it was carrying something, people or cargo or both, and the way it moved suggested cargo as a significant component. She was watching both vehicles when the sedan brakelit suddenly and pulled to the side of the service road, and for 3 seconds she thought they'd been spotted, and then she understood what was actually happening. The sedan had stopped because something was coming the other way, something large and fast, and that something turned out to be 2 of Wren's people in a dark pickup that had come around the western end of the corridor and was now blocking the road. The sedan stopped. The SUV behind it stopped. There were 4 seconds of nothing. Then the sedan's doors opened and she said, "Cole, stop the car." And he stopped the car and she was out of it before she'd fully thought through what she was doing, moving along the edge of the service road in the dark with the low concrete barrier to her left and the black water of the waterfront on her right, because she had no weapon and no backup, and she was running toward a standoff between armed people, which was exactly what Damien had told her not to do. She did it anyway. What she had was information. What she had was the specific knowledge, assembled over weeks of watching delivery patterns and transit windows, and the way certain operations use geography, the way a river used terrain, following the path of least resistance in ways that looked random until you'd watched them long enough. The second vehicle, the SUV, the cargo. She knew where it was going if it got through. She knew because she'd traced the freight corridor on a city map at her kitchen table 3 weeks ago, late at night when she couldn't sleep, following the truck routes east until they terminated at a consolidated transfer point in a warehouse district near the river. She'd noted it because the warehouse district was in the same zip code as a residential block she'd once looked at for her mother 2 years ago, before the medical costs had made that level of rent impossible. She knew the address. She reached Wren's people at the sedan just as the shouting started. The specific shouting of a confrontation that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to become something else. And she grabbed Wren's arm and said, "The SUV." And he looked at her, and she said, "I know where it's going." And he made a decision in under 2 seconds that she appreciated deeply. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He relayed it into his radio in 4 words, an address and a compass direction. And then things moved fast in the way things moved when operational decisions got made and executed without the friction of committee, and 2 of his people broke off from the sedan standoff and moved for their vehicle. And the SUV, Reyes's SUV with its low chassis and its heavy cargo, had a 30-second head start. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough because the freight corridor had a choke point 6 blocks east of them, a narrow bridge over a drainage channel where commercial traffic slowed regardless of urgency. And Wren's people knew the city's geography the way she'd learned the diner's layout, structurally, practically, with the knowledge of people who used it every day. She stood on the service road with the water behind her and the standoff in front of her and listened to the radio traffic, and when Wren said, "We have it," 6 minutes later, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a confirmed outcome, she exhaled once, completely, and then breathed back in. She turned around. Damien was behind her. She hadn't heard him arrive. He was there, 20 feet away, with Wren's remaining 2 people, and a quality about him she hadn't seen before. Not injured, she checked that first. The cut on his cheekbone had bled again and dried again. His jacket was gone. His shirt had a tear at the shoulder that had not been there before. He was looking at her with an expression she had no reference point for at all. "I told you to stay in the vehicle," he said. His voice was entirely level. It was the levelness of someone who had gone through something significant in the last 20 minutes and was now on the other side of it, in the specific stillness that follows extreme action. I know where they were going, she said. Ren has them. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. Garrett's in the hub. She stared at him. He didn't leave the city, Damien said. He was inside the hub, running the coordination locally. A pause. He's contained now. Garrett, his lieutenant, the man who had sold everything, who had pointed the guns at the diner on a Thursday night, knowing Damien would be there, knowing Elena would be there, who had treated both their lives as a transaction he was clearing off his books. She looked at Damien's face, at the cut on his cheekbone, at the tear in his shirt at the shoulder that had not been there before, and understood that whatever had happened inside the hub between him and Garrett was not a conversation. And Reyes, she said. Damien's expression shifted into something she could only describe as unfinished. He was in the hub, he said. He's not there anymore. She understood immediately. He got out before you went in. Through the north exit. We didn't have coverage on the north. She absorbed that. Reyes, the architect of the whole operation, the man who had bought Garrett and positioned Caruso and hit 2 locations in one night and then positioned himself inside his own coordination hub, had exited through the north while they entered from the south. How long ago? She said. 14 minutes. 14 minutes. In a city this size, 14 minutes was enough to disappear into any of 100 different contingency plans, and a man who had run this level of operation for 2 years had contingency plans. He'll consolidate, she said. He lost the hub, he lost the vehicles, he lost his inside man. I know what he'll do, Damien said. Then you know he's not done. No, Damien said, he's not. He looked at her, and neither am I. The waterfront was quiet around them. The distant machinery sounds of the port, the water, the city's ambient frequency. Ren was on his radio. Cole was somewhere behind her. The 2 vehicles from Reyes's operation were contained 6 blocks east. Garrett was in the hub. Reyes was in the wind. And she was standing on a service road at midnight in her work clothes with nothing but what she knew, which had turned out to be enough for tonight, just barely, and would need to be considerably more for what came next. Damien was still looking at her. The expression on his face, the one she had no reference point for, had not changed. She met it and held it the way she'd been holding his eyes since the first night, because that was the one thing she'd never stopped doing, regardless of what else shifted. There's something you're not telling me, she said. He was quiet for a moment, just long enough to confirm it. Reyes made a call from inside the hub, he said, before we breached, 14 minutes before he ran north. He paused. We recovered the call log. She waited. He called a number registered to a property management company in the Bronx, Damien said. The company manages 3 residential buildings. He looked at her. One of them is on Alderman Street. She knew Alderman Street. Her mother lived on Alderman Street. The blood in her hands went cold, and she was already moving before Damien finished the sentence, already turning toward Cole and the vehicle, already calculating the distance between the waterfront and the Bronx, and Damien's hand caught her arm. Not hard, not restraining, just present, stopping the momentum for long enough to say one thing. I already sent people, he said. They left 6 minutes ago. They'll be there before us. His hand tightened slightly. She's going to be all right. She looked at him. She wanted to believe it the way she'd never wanted to believe anything, with a ferocity that surprised her with its own intensity, and she held his eyes and looked for the thing she'd always been able to read in him, the quality of truth underneath the surface of what he said, the baseline she'd learned to trust because it had never yet been wrong. She found it. She breathed. Then we need to move, she said, because all right now is not the same as all right when this is over, and this is not over until Reyes doesn't have anything left to use. Damien looked at her for one more second. Something in his face settled into a decision that went beyond the operational. No, he said quietly. It's not over yet. He released her arm. He turned to Ren. And in the look that passed between them, she understood that the last piece of this, the piece with Reyes's name on it, was about to begin, and that nothing that happened in the next few hours would resemble anything either of them could have predicted from the beginning of this night. She got into the vehicle. The city moved past the windows, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere in it a man named Reyes was making his last moves on a board that was running out of squares. The drive to the Bronx took 19 minutes. Elena counted them the way she'd counted everything lately. Not consciously, but with the background mechanism of a person who had learned that numbers were the one thing that didn't lie, that didn't shift their meaning depending on who was saying them or what they needed from you. 19 minutes of sitting in the back of the SUV with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window and the city moving past in its midnight version, all yellow sodium light and empty intersections, and the occasional figure on a corner who looked up as the vehicle passed and then looked away. Damien was on the phone for the first 12 minutes. She listened to the shape of the calls without processing the content. The rhythm of a man coordinating the final stages of something large. The specific cadence of orders being given to people who were already in motion. At minute 13, he put the phone in his pocket and was quiet. At minute 16, she said, "Tell me what you know about Reyes's contingency." He looked at her. "What makes you think I know?" "You recovered the call log from the hub. You had 14 minutes before we left the waterfront. You've been running calculations since we got in the car." She paused. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Reyes has a secondary location, not operational, residential. An apartment he keeps under a different name in the Fordham area. We've had it flagged for 6 weeks, but it was never active enough to move on. It's active now." "We believe so." "That's where he's going." "That's where he is," Damien said. "Past tense. He's been there for—" He checked his watch. "Approximately 22 minutes. She looked at him. "You know exactly where he is." "Yes." "And you're going to the Bronx first." "Yes." She understood what that meant. That he was taking her to her mother before he moved on Reyes. That he had made that choice without being asked. That the choice had a weight she wasn't ready to address directly. So she looked back out the window and let it sit there between them, acknowledged but unspoken. The apartment building on Alderman Street was a 6-story brick structure that had been built in the 60s and had the particular tired dignity of a building that had absorbed more history than it had been designed for. 2 of Wren's people were outside when they arrived, standing at the building entrance with the practiced casualness of men who wanted to look like they belonged there, which they mostly achieved. "Clear," one of them said when Damien stepped out. Elena was already moving toward the entrance. She took the stairs to the 2nd floor. She'd taken these stairs 100 times, the specific pattern of them, the 3rd step that creaked, the landing that smelled permanently of someone's cooking from the apartment adjacent to the stairwell. She took them fast and knocked on her mother's door with 3 knocks. The code they'd had since Elena was a child, 2 quick and 1 slow. The door opened and Dolores was there. And behind Dolores the living room was lit and Ruth was in her chair by the window, awake, with the specific alertness of someone who had been woken by unusual activity and had not gone back to sleep. "Elena," Ruth said. Not a question, not surprise. Just her name, said with the particular intonation a mother uses when a child appears at an unexpected hour and the mother has already been doing the math in her head. "I'm okay," Elena said. She crossed the room and crouched in front of the chair and looked at her mother's face. Ruth was 61 and looked older, had looked older since the illness started, but her eyes were as clear as they'd always been, dark and sharp, and currently conducting a very thorough assessment of her daughter's appearance. "You have something on your cheek," Ruth said. Elena touched her cheek, dried chemical residue from the fire suppression system in the kitchen. She'd forgotten about that. "There were some men outside," Ruth said. "An hour ago. I saw them from the window. They're gone now." "Men your age with that look." "I know, they're gone." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Her hands were in her lap, the hands that didn't work the way they used to, that had stopped cooperating with the intricate work they'd spent a lifetime doing. She lifted one of them now, slowly, and put it against Elena's face, and Elena held very still. "How bad?" Ruth said. "It's handled." "That's not what I asked." Elena looked at her mother's face, at the lines in it and the clarity behind the lines and the specific courage of a woman who had raised a daughter alone and gotten sick and continued, who had not stopped being herself because her hands stopped working, who was sitting in her chair at midnight with chemical residue on her daughter's face and 2 strange men gone from outside her building and was asking the direct question because she had always asked the direct question. "Bad," Elena said, "but handled." Ruth's hand moved from her cheek. She nodded once. "Are you going back out?" "Yes." Then go. Ruth settled back in her chair. Dolores will stay. I know. Elena. Her mother's voice stopped her at the door. Come back. She looked at her mother across the small living room, the lamp lit, the chair by the window, the ordinary geography of a life that had been threatened tonight by forces her mother didn't fully understand and didn't need to, because understanding wasn't the point. Existing was the point. Continuing was the point. And she was here, and she was fine, and Elena had a remaining debt to collect from the man who had made that threat. I'll come back, she said. She went back down the stairs. Damien was waiting on the sidewalk. He looked at her when she came out, and she gave him one nod, and that was the entirety of the exchange they needed. Fordham, she said. They went. The Fordham address was a residential building on a quiet street, the kind of street that existed in the spaces between the city's louder versions of itself. Narrow, tree-lined, mostly dark at this hour, the buildings modest and close together. Reyes's apartment was on the 4th floor, northwest corner, and Damien had that information because he was Damien Moreau, and he had run a significant criminal operation in this city for 8 years, and the information apparatus that supported that operation, even depleted, even with Garrett's betrayal carved out of it, was still functional enough to produce an address and a floor and a corner. They went in with 6 people. Wren led the entry. Damien was directly behind him. Elena came third, which was not the position Damien had assigned her. He'd assigned her the lobby, with Cole, but the lobby was 40 feet and a closed stairwell door from where the information she carried was relevant, and she'd made that calculation on the way up and acted on it. He noticed her behind him on the 2nd floor landing. He looked at her. She held his eyes. He looked away and kept moving, which she understood as acceptance, or as something close enough to acceptance that the distinction didn't matter right now. The 4th floor corridor was empty, northwest corner. The door looked like every other door on the floor. Standard residential, hollow core, the kind that offered the impression of a barrier rather than an actual one. Wren looked at Damien. Damien nodded. The door did not withstand the next 4 seconds. What happened inside the apartment in the following minutes was not clean. Nothing about it was clean. Reyes had 2 men with him, not his full contingency, not the operation he would have had if tonight had gone differently, but 2 men who were present and armed and responding, and the apartment was small, and small spaces did not resolve quickly. Elena stayed in the hallway. She stayed in the hallway because she had made the rational assessment that inside a small apartment with 6 people who knew what they were doing and 2 opposing, the specific things she contributed, information, pattern recognition, the ability to see structural logic in operational behavior, was not what was needed in the next 90 seconds, and inserting herself into a space where her presence added risk. Without adding capability was not courage, it was ego. And she'd spent too long surviving on careful judgment to abandon it now because of the adrenaline still moving through her system. She stood in the hallway and listened and waited. It took 4 minutes. When Wren came back into the hallway, he had a cut on his forearm that was bleeding through his sleeve and an expression that communicated outcome without requiring elaboration. He looked at Elena. He nodded once. She went in. The apartment was a wreck. Furniture displaced, a lamp broken, the specific disorder of a space where a concentrated physical confrontation has occurred. Reyes's 2 men were on the floor, contained. Reyes himself was standing against the far wall with Damien 3 feet in front of him, and the configuration of it, Damien's posture, Reyes's posture, the specific geometry of the space between them, told her that this part was not finished yet. Reyes was older than she'd expected. She'd built an image of him from the information she'd accumulated. The operational scale, the multi-month planning, the audacity of hitting 2 of Damien's locations in a single night. And the image had been of someone physically imposing, carrying his ambition in his body. The reality was a man in his mid-50s, compact, gray at the temples, with the eyes of someone who had been doing careful calculations for a long time and had recently watched several of them fail simultaneously. He looked at Elena when she came in. Not at Damien, at her. "The waitress," he said. "The waitress," she confirmed. Something moved in his expression. Not contempt. She'd expected contempt and would have known how to respond to it. This was something closer to genuine assessment. the expression of a man recalibrating a variable he had significantly undervalued. "You mapped the freight corridor from delivery patterns," he said. "I had time," she said. "Nobody was watching me." He almost smiled. It was a grim, stripped-down version of a smile, the expression of a man who could appreciate an irony even from inside its consequences. "No," he said. "Nobody was." "That was a mistake," she said. "Yours." "Yes." He looked at Damien. The almost smile was gone. "And Garrett. That was a mistake too, as it turned out." "Garrett told you what you asked him to tell you," Damien said. His voice was very quiet. The quiet was not calm. It was the specific compression of something that had been building since he'd understood the scope of the betrayal, since he'd seen the call log, since he'd stood in a diner kitchen and looked at his operation's structural failure made manifest. "He told you about Elena because you asked specifically about vulnerabilities, about people I'd extended trust to." Reyes said nothing. "He told you she was useful to me," Damien said. "He told you taking her out would cost me something. That was the logic of putting her in the diner on a Thursday." "Efficient," Reyes said. "One location, two problems." "She's not a problem," Damien said. "That was the miscalculation." The two men looked at each other across the 3 feet of wrecked apartment, and Elena watched the exchange with the full attention she'd been applying to Damien's silences and expressions for 2 months, reading the current beneath the surface, the thing the words were carrying underneath themselves. What she saw in Damien was not rage. She'd expected rage, or the cold operational version of it. What she saw was something quieter and more final. The expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a long sequence of events and was now in the moment of completion. And the completion did not feel like triumph. It felt like the closing of a door, necessary, irrevocable, heavy. "Where's Garrett?" Damien said. "Your people have him," Reyes said. "You know that." "I know that." A pause. "I'm asking if you have anything to say about him, about what you promised him." Reyes looked at him for a moment. "I promised him safety," he said. "A position. The standard offer for someone willing to move from one side to the other." He paused. "He was useful, for a time." "For a time," Damien repeated. "These arrangements have limits," Reyes said. "Everyone understands that, including him." The sentence landed in the room with its full implication, that Garrett, having served his purpose, would have been managed the same way Reyes managed all completed utilities. That the man who had sold Damien's operation, who had put a gun effectively against Elena's chest by pointing Reyes's people at the diner on a Thursday night, had been operating under the belief that he was trading one structure for another, and that belief had been the last in a series of miscalculations that defined his choices. Elena thought about Garrett without being able to fully picture his face, because she'd only seen him twice, peripherally, at a distance. She thought about what it meant to trust someone with the full architecture of your operation and have them dismantle it piece by piece from the inside. She thought about how that felt from Damien's position. Not the strategic failure of it, but the human failure, the specific wound of betrayal by someone you had extended genuine trust to. She thought about what she would have done if Marcus had been Garrett. If Marcus had been feeding information to someone on the outside, using the diner as a mechanism in someone else's operation, treating her trust as a commodity. She couldn't hold the thought. It was too specific, too close. What happened next happened quickly and without drama, which was, in its own way, the most striking thing about it. Damien made a decision. She saw it in the settlement of his posture, the same quality she'd been reading for 2 months. And that decision was communicated to Ren without words, and the final chapter of the Reyes operation was closed in the manner that operations of this kind were closed. In a small apartment in Fordham, on a Friday morning with the first gray light beginning somewhere beyond the windows. She was in the hallway when it happened. She stayed in the hallway. She looked at the wall across from her, at the generic framed print someone had put up. A landscape, mountains, the kind of image that existed to fill space without demanding attention. She looked at it and breathed steadily and understood that this was the price of the life she'd entered 7 weeks ago when she'd gotten into the black SUV, and that knowing the price didn't make it cost less, and that she had chosen this anyway, and that the choosing had been real and the consequences were real, and the only thing left to do was continue being the person she'd decided to be inside all of it. Damien came back into the hallway 4 minutes later. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. "Garrett," she said finally. He'll be dealt with, Damien said. Differently. She looked at him. He'll leave, Damien said. The city, the country. He'll have enough to go and a very clear understanding of what happens if he comes back or surfaces or makes contact with anyone connected to anything I've ever touched. A pause. That's the decision I made. She absorbed that. The decision he'd made, not execution, which she'd braced for, but exile, which was something else entirely, which was a choice that came from somewhere other than pure operational logic. Why? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Because I've been thinking about something you said. In the diner, one of the Thursday nights. About what loyalty actually costs. He paused. You said people follow out of fear or out of something real, and that fear made people into Garrett eventually, into someone who calculated their way out the first time the calculation came out negative. She remembered saying something like that. She hadn't thought he was listening as carefully as he apparently had been. Killing him makes him a lesson, Damien said. Letting him live with what he did makes him something else. She didn't argue with it. It wasn't her call to argue with, but she noted it, filed it next to everything else she'd filed over the past 2 months, in the part of her understanding of him that kept revising itself upward from the initial assessment. They left the apartment at 2:17 a.m. The drive back to Manhattan was quiet. Wren's arm had been bandaged with something from the vehicle's kit. Cole drove. The city was in its deepest hour, the window between the last of the night people and the first of the morning ones, when the streets produced a silence that wasn't actually silence but had the quality of it, a reduction in the city's surface noise that revealed the deeper sound underneath, the constant mechanical breath of a thing that didn't stop. Elena looked out the window and took inventory. Not of the night's events. She'd do that later, when there was space for it. An inventory of herself, of what she'd walked into the diner with 11 weeks ago, and what she was carrying now, and what the distance between those two things meant. She'd walked in with debt and exhaustion, and a mother she couldn't adequately care for, and a job that paid $9.40 an hour, and the specific invisibility of a person the city had decided wasn't worth seeing. She was carrying something different now, and she understood that the difference was not only circumstantial. Something had changed structurally, in the way she occupied a room, in the way she processed threat and information and the gap between what people said and what they meant. In the way she understood that the person who didn't bend when the gun came out had always been in her, not created by the last 11 weeks, but uncovered by them. The way pressure didn't create the quality of a material so much as it revealed whether the quality was there. She had not become someone else. She had become more entirely herself. That understanding arrived quietly, without announcement, the way the truest things tended to arrive. Damien spoke at 2:34, somewhere on the approach to the bridge. The diner, he said. She looked at him. The ownership transfers to you completely, he said. No conditions, no arrangement, the deed, the accounts, everything. I'll have it done by end of week. She looked at him steadily. Why? Because you earned it. He paused. And because what I put you into without full disclosure, the freight corridor, the actual nature of the drops, that was a debt that needed addressing. She was quiet for a moment. You're not going to say you're sorry. I'm not going to say I'm sorry, he agreed. Okay, she said. I can work with that. He almost smiled. The precise, controlled almost smile. The financial arrangements for your mother's care. I'll continue those independently. No strings. I'll pay you back, she said immediately. Elena, I'll pay you back, she said again. On a schedule I set. That's how it works. He looked at her. The almost smile had become something more complete. Not large, not performed, but real in the way that small things were real. The way the things you didn't choose to put on were the most accurate indicators of what was underneath. All right, he said. She looked back out the window. They were on the bridge now, the river below them black and moving, the city's lights reflected in it in long broken lines that shifted with the current. She thought about the notebook in her locked drawer, about the cost breakdown she'd built for the diner's first quarter under her actual management, the projections she'd started making for what a legitimately profitable Carla's could look like in 2 years, if she did the work she already knew how to do. She thought about Yolanda and Marcus and the staff roster on the clipboard and the C and the sign that burned steady now. She thought about what she was going to tell Marcus, how much of the truth was useful and how much would only burden a man who hadn't signed up for any of this. She decided she would tell him enough. Not everything, but enough. Enough for him to understand why the last 11 weeks had been what they were. Enough to give him the choice she'd promised him she would always give. She thought he'd stay. She wasn't certain, but she thought he'd stay. 3 weeks later, the diner reopened. Elena had closed it for 2 weeks after the night of the broken windows, telling the staff that the damage required structural repair, which was true in more ways than the literal one. The glass was replaced. The kitchen was cleaned and reorganized. 2 of the booth seats that had caught shrapnel from the window were reupholstered in a slightly different color than the originals. Not because she couldn't match it exactly, but because she decided she didn't want to. The difference was visible if you looked for it. She intended to keep looking for it. She hired 3 new staff members. Not to replace anyone, Marcus stayed, Yolanda stayed, the kitchen crew stayed. But because the diner was busier than it had been before, and busier legitimately, without the secondary revenue stream that had been quietly subsidizing its operations for 2 months. She needed the bodies, and she hired people who needed the work, with the specific attention to circumstance that came from having been, not long ago, the person nobody hired twice. She put a sign in his window that said, "Now, hiring, no experience necessary, apply inside." It was not a sophisticated recruitment strategy. It was what she had. It worked. Marcus found her in the back office. Her office, the actual office now, with the desk properly organized and a new filing cabinet and a lamp that didn't flicker. On the 3rd day of the reopening, during the mid-morning lull, he stood in the doorway with his apron on and his arms crossed and his expression in the particular configuration that meant he'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it. "I'm not going to ask," he said. "I know," she said. "I just want to know one thing." She looked at him. "Okay. Is it done?" She thought about Reyes, about Garrett somewhere that wasn't New York, living with the specific weight of someone who had burned every structure they'd built and walked away from the rubble. About Vincent Caruso, who had been dealt with in the weeks following the night at the hub through mechanisms she hadn't been directly part of and hadn't asked for a full accounting of. About the Monday meetings that would not be resumed, the back room that was now simply a back room, the alley where green canvas bags had moved in the dark and did not move anymore. "Yes," she said. "It's done." He nodded. He uncrossed his arms. "Okay," he said, and went back to the grill. She sat in the office for a moment after he left, in the particular quiet of a space that had been claimed, not given, not inherited, but taken in the specific way that involved cost and intention and the willingness to keep standing when the standing required more than you thought you had. Damien came in the following Thursday. Of course he did. At 9:15, center table, 2 bodyguards instead of 4. The charcoal suit replaced by something darker. The cut on his cheekbone healed to a faint line she noticed because she'd been watching his face long enough to know its geography. He sat down. He did not look at the menu. She came over with a coffee, black, already poured, because she'd seen the SUV from the window and had poured it before he reached the door, a fact she did not draw attention to because it would have required acknowledging that she'd been watching for it. She set it down. He looked up at her. "You fixed the sign," he said. "Weeks ago," she said. "You notice now." "I noticed before," he said. "I'm saying it now." She looked at him across the table. The diner was half full. The soup woman was in her usual booth, a new regular who came on Thursdays and ordered pie and worked on a laptop, 2 cab drivers at the counter. The normal texture of the place, the specific ordinary life of it that she had apparently decided was worth fighting for, and had fought for, and had won in the specific way that winning looked when it came out the other end of what she'd been through. Not clean, not undamaged, but standing. "Pot roast is good tonight," she said. Something in his expression moved, the almost smile but warmer than the previous iterations, and more unguarded and more entirely real. "It always is," he said. She went back to the counter. She refilled 2 coffees, checked on the soup woman, cleared a table in the back. She moved through the diner the way she'd moved through it for years, with the efficiency of someone who knew the space completely, every sightline and surface and squeaking floorboard, but differently too, in a way she couldn't have precisely articulated, but that was visible, she suspected, to anyone paying attention. She was no longer invisible. She didn't fully understand when that had changed, whether it was the night of the gun, or the SUV, or the kitchen with the fryer basket, or the service road on the waterfront, or the stairs to her mother's apartment. Maybe it wasn't one moment. Maybe invisibility wasn't something that ended in a moment, the way certain other things ended. Maybe it ended the way water carved stone, gradually, through the sustained application of a force the stone didn't know how to stop. She had been that force, applied to herself, through everything the last 11 weeks had required of her. At 10:30, when the diner had thinned to a few tables and the kitchen was winding down, she stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the street. The neon sign threw its light across the sidewalk in the particular red-orange that had always been the color of this block's nights. And the traffic was light, and a woman was walking fast on the opposite sidewalk with her coat pulled tight against the October cold that had returned, cycling back around as it did every year. Elena watched her pass. She thought about the version of herself that had stood behind this counter 11 weeks ago, running on exhaustion and borrowed time, carrying the weight of everything she owed in a box in the back of her skull, with the lid shut because opening it accomplished nothing. She thought about that woman with something that was not quite pity and not quite pride, but occupied the territory between those two things. A recognition, clean and honest, of what it had taken to get from there to here, and of the fact that the distance was real and the journey had cost something she would not get back, and that she would make the same choices again if she had to. Not because the choices had been easy, because they'd been hers. The neon sign buzzed softly. The sea burned steady. She turned away from the window, picked up a clean cloth, and wiped down the counter with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was exactly where they'd decided to be. Not rescued, not remade, not saved by anything other than the refusal, sustained through everything, to be less than she was capable of. The diner smelled like coffee, and something frying, and the particular accumulated warmth of a room where people came to be fed, and it was hers, and the night outside was cold, and she had work to do. She did the work. End.